Radio Mano Papachango.
What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another edition of Tangentially Speaking. This episode is a conversation I had a couple of months ago with a guy named HARLEY RUSTAD, R-U-S-T-A-D. He wrote a book called Lost in the Valley of Death about my friend Justin Alexander. If you're new to the podcast and you don't know who Justin Alexander was, highly recommend that you go into the archives, check out some episodes there, look him up on Instagram. His feed is still alive and well, even if he isn't. The basic outlines of the story are that Justin was a traveler, a photographer, a storyteller, a beautiful guy in many, many ways. Beautiful physically. He had a beautiful eye for images. He had a great eye for story, for narrative. He was a good friend. He was someone I got to know through the podcast, and our relationship extended well beyond it. We ended up spending about a month together in northern Thailand. What was it, 4 years ago now? Maybe 5? I think it was 2016. And then he went to Nepal, worked there, building a school for kids that had been destroyed in an earthquake. And then he went to India and got involved with a guy who claimed to be a sadhu, although my friend Viram, who spent 20 years in India, explained to me that real sadhu, a sadhu's a spiritual person, but that real sadhus don't look for foreigners to hang out with. They don't ask people for money. They don't invite people to come on trips with them into the mountains. They don't do a lot of things that this guy did. And anyway, Justin got mixed up with this guy, ended up going with him into the Himalayas, into a valley. He was going to live in a cave for a while. He did live in a cave for a while. And Justin never came back. The sadhu did, as well as a Nepali, what's the word for someone who kind of carries your bags, a guy. Anyway, he was there, and the sadhu got arrested when suspicions were raised about where Justin may be, and then the sadhu very conveniently died in the prison cell. The story is that he hanged himself when the guard stepped outside to take a piss. So he can't be interviewed, and the mystery remains, and I guess will always remain, as to exactly what happened to Justin. Some people think he may still be alive out there somewhere, because that's the kind of guy Justin was. The kind of guy he was in the sense that he loved adventure. And what could be a bigger adventure than dying and living a different life? But he wasn't the kind of guy who would put his friends and family through incredible pain. So I don't think Justin's alive. In any case, that's what this conversation's about. HARLEY did a lot of research, traveled all over, tracing Justin's steps, actually found the cave where Justin spent his last days, and we talk about all that. It's a really interesting conversation. It's a great book. They sent me a review copy, and as I said to HARLEY, I didn't want to like it. I am very kind of leery of anything that feels like exploitation of Justin. and his story. And so I was kind of predisposed to not be a fan of this book, but when I started reading it, I quickly realized that Harley was coming at it from a position of respect and kindness and genuine curiosity. And he never met Justin, but having spent time with both of them, I have no doubt that Justin would have respected Harley, and he would be happy with the way that Harley tells his story. So if you're interested in knowing more about Justin, I highly recommend this book, and I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Justin. As far as my particular situation goes, I'm still on Kopayam. If you're looking at Google Earth or something, it's an island off the coast of Thailand. Closest city is Ranong. It's near the border with Burma. We look out from the beach and see islands that are part of Myanmar, also known as Burma. It's beautiful. It's basically empty. There are lots of hurdles to getting into Thailand as a tourist right now, which keep most people away. I'd say probably there might be 10% the normal number of tourists around. So things are empty and beautiful. And man, there's this big beach that we walk on every day at sunset, and there's almost no garbage on the beach, which is sadly a rare and amazing thing to find a beach. I mean, even in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the beaches are covered in plastic trash, and for some reason this one isn't. So that's pretty awesome. On the other hand, there are fucking sandflies and mosquitoes, and I am covered in bites, and I am so fucking itchy. And it reminds me of this quote I read recently, which is that nostalgia is memory without detail. I've been thinking about that a lot, because I feel like it's a thing we do in our thinking so often. We remember relationships, and we think about how much we love that person, and we think about how good it was when it was good, but we don't generally think about how bad it was when it was bad. And we generally don't remember the annoyances. And so when I look at photos of Thailand or, beautiful islands, tropical islands, it's like, yeah, we look at the photo and it's like, oh, that's beautiful. Look at that. That's so beautiful. But the fucking sandflies don't come out of the photo and bite you and remind you what it feels like to be there. I mean, believe me, I'm not complaining. I don't want to come across as like, listen to that asshole complaining about the sandflies in paradise. I'm just saying, like, our perceptions are incomplete, and try to remember that there is, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, there are really awesome aspects of it, and there are aspects that aren't so awesome, but when you remember it, you're probably not going to remember the unawesome. You're going to remember the awesome, hopefully, if you're oriented that way. So try to enjoy the awesomeness of wherever you are, whatever you're doing, and I will try to ignore the 24 intensely burning, itching bumps on my legs and back and arms. Oh my God, I'm so itchy. All right, I'm going to play you out with a song that is appropriately haunting. It's a song I played once before on the podcast. It's called Border Country. It's by the Paper Stars. And it's a song about an adventurer. In this case, it's a skier who's doing some backcountry skiing, and the night before he goes out, I guess it was in the Rocky Mountains, he wrote some notes in his journal that was found later. and after he had been caught in an avalanche and died, and it turns out that the notes that he had written in his journal were images of dying in an avalanche. And I have to believe that my friend Justin had many such visions of his demise. He saw himself largely, I think, as the star of a movie or a book about him. And so he would be strangely satisfied, I don't know if that's the word, or unsurprised that there's a book about him. And, you know, if you look at his Instagram feed, you see that he saw himself as the object of his own attention in many ways. And I don't mean that purely as a kind of silly, egotistical thing. I mean that as a way of inhabiting one's own life. Anyway, this song is called Border Country. It's haunting and beautiful and about adventure and risk and how some of us, at least in our imaginations perhaps, are able to transcend borders and move into other realms. Miss you, Justin. All right, here we are with Harley RUSTAD. This is a special experience for me, Harley. Before we go any further, I just want to congratulate you on your book, Lost in the Valley of Death, about a friend of mine, Justin Alexander. And, you know, when I say it's a really good book, I'm coming from the perspective of somebody who has a lot of emotional investment in that story. And I think I'm kind of primed to not love it. You know what I mean? I saw a TV show that they did. I don't even remember who it was, but I think you were in touch with them. I remember there were a group of different people who were all interested in Justin's story. And that was some kind of reality bullshit and, you know, commercial breaks. And it just felt so exploitative. And when I was watching it, I thought, am I pissed off because this is Justin, right? If I didn't know the guy that they were talking about, would I still be pissed off, or would I just think, it's another bullshit TV show? So when you have an emotional connection to somebody, it's like a portrait of somebody you love. If they come out, if it's not accurate or it doesn't align with your understanding of them, or it feels like the artist was dismissive in some way, it's so easy to have a bad reaction. But you guys sent me the PDF of the book, and I sat down thinking I would just read a chapter and kind of get a feel for it. And I spent the next 3 hours, I couldn't stop. It was fantastic. So thank you for the care you put into that book.
Well, I mean, thank you so much. That means the world to hear. I mean, particularly from somebody who knew him as well as you did. You know, it's been a journey for me since I started working on this story, and since I came across Justin, and to talk with so many people who, including yourself, who cared about him, who met him on the road, who had long experiences and relationships with him, and fleeting ones. It never fazed me that I was dealing with somebody's life and someone's life story, and I didn't take that lightly. So that really means a lot to hear that.
Yeah. Now this isn't your first book, right? I know you're a journalist, and what else have you written?
Yeah, I'm a Canadian journalist, and I work at a magazine called The Walrus, based in Toronto, which is my day job. But I've also, my first book came out in 2018, which was called Big Lonely Doug, which was about one of the largest Douglas fir trees in Canada that was saved by a logger and became this environmental icon. So that was my first book. And And I'm from out west, a small island in British Columbia, and so that story felt very close to my heart. And this one too felt very close to my heart too. I spent a couple of years in India before coming across this story, and so I felt kind of primed to write this one as well. And so both of them were very kind of personal journeys for me as well.
Which island are you from?
It's called Salt Spring Island. It's right in between Vancouver and Vancouver Island and Victoria. It's kind of a little back in the 70s and 80s. It was a bit of a hippie, back to the lander place, and my parents moved there in the early 80s, and I was born and raised there. It's cool. It's paradise. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. I've been there. I've spent a fair amount of time in those islands. Up Cortez Island, I have a friend who has a house up there, and so we sort of bopped around a bunch of islands. That's an amazing place up there. I remember I was on a friend who has a boat. He took us to a place, I can't remember, Desolation Bay maybe, or Destruction Bay.
Desolation Sound?
It was like... Yeah, maybe. Yeah. And there are all these slabs of rock going into the water that get heated by the sun, and it's like the warmest water north of Mexico or something in the Pacific. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it is a beautiful corner of the world, and I'm super lucky to go back there often. And it's true. It has, unparalleled nature. I can't get enough of it, even from somebody who was born and raised there. It's big mountains, big trees, and big ocean. And I just adore it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you were in India. What were you doing in India? Were you just bopping around, or were you researching something else? The first trip I did in 2008, 2009 was about a full year. I could get a year tourist visa. And I went kind of as kind of a classic post-university graduate, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Let's go to India and kind of figure things out. Not an uncommon trajectory for people. But I was really inspired by my dad, who went there in 67, 68. He had this incredible 3-year around the world trip, in part that took him to South Asia. He was in Africa, South Africa, East Africa, then took a boat across to India. And so I grew up with all these stories of his travels, and there was something about India that really connected with me, that really resonated with me, unlike any of his other stories. And it was kind of hard to put a finger on what that was exactly. It was partly the landscape, the spirit of the Himalaya, but also a bit of the spiritual side of that part of the world, and this incredible multi-layered history, and the food. It was just kind of this incredible combination of everything that I wanted to explore. And so I set out initially with my dad for the first month, and that was quite a trip for him to go back 40 years later, because the country had changed dramatically. Wow. I mean, there weren't many motorcycles and scooters and motorized rickshaws in 1967 as there are now. So that was a big dramatic change for him. And he had just turned 65, and I was kind of this, young 20-something, and we were both kind of going through these, transitions in our lives. And we set off up to the north and tried to do this big hike, and it never actually ended up working out for us for a few reasons. And so when he went back, I continued on, and I went to almost every single state in the country, the northern tip right down to the southern tip, and east to west, and about a month in Nepal. And, almost the entire trip was on my own. And I really, it was there that I kind of started writing in earnest, looking at stories and looking at places and kind of looking at issues in a different way and wanting to kind of share them and communicate them. So, there's a lot of that first trip was me figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. And it set me on a path that I think I still am on right now. And I'm extremely fortunate. And I look back at that year as being a profoundly transformative one for where I am now and where I ended up. So I went back. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I went back about 4 years later. I went to journalism school and then went back 4 years later to intern for a Canadian newspaper based in Delhi, and was up in Kathmandu for another 4 months and then back down to India. So I've had this kind of two looks at India, 2 different years there. One purely as a traveler and one working in journalism. And I've gone back a couple times since to work on this specific story, this book.
Wow, that's an amazing series of situations there. I mean, going back with your father, that's incredible. I was in India in 1988 the first time, and I go back and it's like, holy shit, what happened to this place? I can't imagine what it's like for him, that experience. I mean, in 87, India still was aligned with the Soviet Union. And so there were no Western companies there. There's no McDonald's, no KFC, no Toyota. There was one kind of car in the whole country, this little Ambassador. And I'm sure your dad told you about this. Every car was the same car. It's all you saw, and so to go back now and see all the variety of just that sort of integration with the Western world is depressing as hell in some ways. And the experience of traveling is so different because of the internet. You don't feel so far away. I had a fucking shortwave radio that I would lie in bed and like pull out the antenna and tune in, and I'd get this is the BBC doing cricket scores, and I was like, oh, English, this is amazing. Like this is the only way I would know if there were a nuclear disaster or something. It felt like I was on another planet. Absolutely. I mean, there was no. This predates Lonely Planet guides when my dad was there, 67. Right. Like that was just starting to come out. He went with a history book, and that was his guide. But also, That's great.
And he took, our house is sort of filled with slides that he took, photographs that he took on his film camera and shipped back home. So he never saw a picture for 3 years that he took, having no idea.
Yeah, I did the same thing. Yeah, you're shooting Kodachrome.
Exactly, and it's like such a different experience to how we travel now, and obviously how Justin traveled was, this kind of intimate relationship with your people, your family back home, and your friends back home, and people who are following along in your travels. But for my dad, even to get money, no ATMs, so he had to send a letter by mail to his parents who had control of his bank accounts back in Vancouver and say, I'm going to be in Delhi in a month. Please send a money order. And they would send a money order to the general post office, and he would go and pick it up. That's how he could stay on the road for 3 years straight. And it's just, now it's a different world.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the obvious question is, what is the resonance between your father and Justin?
My dad went 67, 68. That was, at a time when a lot of Europeans and a lot of Westerners were looking at India as this place of information, of knowledge, of spirituality, of transformation. My dad kind of went the opposite route, but at that time, that was the height of the hippie trail. So all those overlander travelers coming from Europe, through the Middle East to India with this ultimate destination in mind, which was only, skyrocketed by the Beatles in '68, which put turned that trail into a highway. And so my dad went, he went in some ways for similar reasons to how I went, and I think in similar ways to how Justin went at a period in our lives when we didn't exactly know where we wanted to go and felt that this one place could offer something to us in terms of answers, in terms of direction, a compass or knowledge. And, Justin was somebody that from a very, very young age was deeply committed to the search for knowledge and for understanding his place in the universe and in the world. and all those kind of connections between people and between nature, between the earth, and between potentially something bigger than all of us, was something that really drove him. And so even though my dad probably didn't necessarily go for spiritual or religious reasons, at the core of, I think, all of our reasons for going there, and for a lot of people's reasons for going there, is that because India holds something that I think is almost unique in the world in a lot of Western minds, which is a place of transformation, a place that you can go with certain questions and that they will be answered there. And to me, that was kind of the common thread. That's why when I first came across Justin's story, I did think back to my dad, but I really thought back to the reasons why I initially went there. And, you know, there were a lot of similarities there.
So what's the difference between you, me, and your dad on one side and Justin on the other? Is it just luck?
In terms of why we all went?
Why we survived, why we're here to talk about it,
yeah,
and Justin isn't.
Yeah, so I mean, at the crux of this story is a tragedy. At the end of the story is a tragedy, and Justin disappeared in the summer fall of 2016 in a really remote small valley in the Himalayas. And I think for a lot of people, when they land in India, they feel this sort of push and pull. You know, the country either wanting to take something from you or wanting to give something to you. At times it can feel like a carrot, and at times it can feel like a pretty hard stick. And, you know, in ways that, you know, as a Canadian, and I've traveled in lots of different countries around the world, I've never really felt the same. I didn't feel it when I was living in South Korea for a year. I didn't feel it when I was in Europe. I didn't feel it when I was in Tanzania, but I felt it every single day when I was in India. And it's this force that sometimes feels like, yes, it's dangling this possibility of you can find spirituality, you can find your calling around the next corner, but also I'm going to confront you with some hard realities of this world. And India is a country that isn't shy with presenting those hard realities to me when I first landed there as, you know, a fairly naive 24-year-old, and to a lot of people, that there is, you know, poverty like I've never seen before, and a lot of pain alongside the incredible beauty that country offers. And so for a lot of people, they can either get caught up in that, they can push it away, they can reject it, and they can hate India. And I'm sure there's a ton of people who you've talked with who've gone to India who've just, it's been too much, it's been overwhelming, they've hated it, and they'll never go back. And that's fair, and that's a totally fair reaction. But I think for other people, that curiosity pulls them along. And in some cases, it pulls them strongly and far along. And I think Justin was somebody who was not only open to those experiences that were presented or those challenges, but willingly really pushed himself to find those ones. And so for me, I remember when I first started researching into Justin's story, and I thought back to all those experiences I had when I was in India, including one where I went on a solo hike to the source of a holy river in Gangotri, to the source of the Ganges, completely on my own in a very, very similar way to how Justin disappeared. And it made me wonder, what were the differences here? Why did I come back okay, and why did he not? And, you know, I talk a lot about that in the book of Justin's trust in people, this kind of wonderful trust that he gave to people, but in sometimes maybe misguided trust. But also, I think when you are pushing yourself, you increase the chance of danger. And he was never, since he was a little kid through his teenage years, all the way up to when he disappeared, he was never shy of putting himself in a dangerous situation, because he knew that in those moments, in those extremes, he can get something out of that. And so I think that's kind of the biggest difference, is that he really strove, he really pushed himself to see what he could find at those at those extremities.
Yeah, that's that's a good way to put it. I vacillate. I mean, I think you and I talked about this a bit when you interviewed me for the book. You know, I admire him and I miss him, but I'm also angry at him. And it's an anger, I think, that has a lot of shame mixed in with it, because and it cuts in two different ways. One way is I have traveled in a lot of places where I was close to some sort of edge, but I rarely went out to the edge. So, you know, in a physical way, you know, like I've been in places where if I'd been willing to get inoculated and do a quarantine and learn some language and hike for a week, I could have been with a remote tribe of hunter-gatherers, you know, but I didn't. I stayed in the guest house and, you know, got up and drank coffee and hung out in the hammock and, you know, went swimming. And part of me feels ashamed of that like, man, you went so close, but you didn't take those last few steps to really go somewhere amazing, right? You sort of went to where no tourists were, very few backpackers were, but then you didn't go past that, you know? Right. So there's that, but then there's also the other side where I did go to an edge and I almost killed myself. Whether it was with heroin in Chiang Mai or a motorcycle that I almost crashed and had no business renting, you know, like, and then I think about all the pain that I would have caused to my friends and family the way Justin did. And I feel some shame there and say, well, the only difference is I was lucky, you know, that I took crazy risks too. So it's weird. Like half of it is I wish I'd taken more risks, and other half is I regret the ones I did take. So I'm kind of, I haven't come down to a solid static narrative as to how I feel about Justin or how I feel about myself, I suppose is what I'm ultimately saying.
And I get that. And, you know, and I felt, you know, similar things, in my own life. And I think I'm just a little bit more cautious, when it comes to some of these things. So I tend to stay pretty far from that edge, you know, but I've also done things that, you know, my parents have not been happy with, in terms of climbing mountains or, you know, not being in touch for a couple of weeks, as I bum around selfishly. But I think, and I don't want to present the fact that I'm passing any kind of judgment on him by any means, or somebody who does want to push that, because, you know, luck is a factor. How much of a factor it is up to debate, but it is always a factor. And you know, being at the wrong place at the wrong time or meeting the wrong person at the wrong time is always kind of a nature of independent travel. And same with trust. You always, you know, when you're traveling in a group, you're traveling with your partner, you always kind of have this little bubble, this little shield around you. But when you're on your own, you're open to those conversations, you're open to meeting new people, and you're open for someone to say, hey, here's my hand, let me take you off to this great experience. And so seeing, you know, what ultimately happened to Justin, which is trusting a person, in this case, a Hindu sadhu who he had befriended, lead him into the mountains up to this holy lake, where only the sadhu returned. I understand that core desire for experience. I understand that. And, you know, why did I come back from the source of the Ganges River and Justin did not from the source of the Parvati? Does have a lot to do with luck in the end. And that's, I think, what makes the story so tragic. And I think also so relatable, is that a lot of travelers, even someone as cautious as I, could put themselves in his shoes and feel like, you know, yes, he was pushing himself, himself, physically, emotionally. But I could have been in that situation just like he was. And I could have been drawn to what I could find at those mountains, whether it was a view or a profound experience. And I think that's ultimately why I really wanted to tell this story, is that I felt like Justin's life was relatable on so many different levels. And I think a lot of readers who have that adventurous spirit in them, who do have some kind of deep burning dissatisfaction with something in their life, will see elements of theirs in his.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's a very relatable story. And it's a testament to how well written it is, that you know from the beginning how it ends, but you're still compelled to read it, right? It's not a mystery. Like, well, it is a mystery, but it's, you sort of see the shape of the story before you really get into it. I mean, everyone listening to this, of course, I'll discuss who Justin was in the intro, so they all know what we're talking about, but it's still, and maybe even because of that, it's fascinating. Because it leads you to ask these questions about, what someone gets cancer. Everybody wants to say, oh, yeah, but, he smoked, or he drank too much, or he ate too much of this or too much. Everyone wants to find reasons for it that make them feel safer, and so it's always so disturbing when someone who's doing the same things that you love to do comes to a sad end like this. Mm-hmm. Another reason I mentioned earlier that I feel some anger toward Justin, and I was sort of thinking of this when I asked, what's the difference between you, me, your dad, and Justin? And you touched on it when you talked about your dad taking photos, Kodachrome. The only place to get, if he was using Kodachrome, which I guess he was, the only place to get that stuff developed was in the U.S. And I think there might have been one plant in Europe. So you would shoot your rolls of film, put them in these prepaid bags that they gave you when you bought it, and ship them off to the U.S., hope they arrived, they would get developed, sent to your parents or whatever, and years later you would see these photos you're taking. And, as opposed to Justin filming himself. I mean, people can go to his Instagram page, which I think is still active, Adventures of Justin, and see these amazing, and he's a super good looking guy. I mean, fashion model, attractive, really good photographer. And there are just all these amazing shots of him cruising on his motorcycle or hanging from a tree or, jumping off some cliff somewhere. And the thing is, Justin was in a movie about Justin. And when I was with him, I felt like he was in a movie about himself all the time. Whereas I don't think your dad or me or you envision our lives quite that way. And I don't know to what extent it's a technological thing, because I feel like so many people, like Justin in a sense was killed by Instagram. He was killed by the need to create content for a bunch of fucking strangers, So there's something about that. And I remember talking with him about that. And it's like, dude, grow the fuck up. You're not living your life for a bunch of strangers online, I don't know. Sorry. This whole story is so personal for me.
Yeah. And I understand that. And I think that was, in talking with, so many people who were close friends with him or met him along the way, that was something that constantly came up, was this tension between what he was doing. Was he doing that for himself because he genuinely loved to travel, to adventure, to do, crazy, dangerous things? Did he genuinely love doing that from like a true, authentic, hate to use that word, but from a true core part of his being? Did he love that and get so much out of it? Or was he doing those things for his audience? And I think the motivation there at times probably flipped between the two. And I think at certain times, of course, it was very clear he loved traveling and he loved meeting people who had, a skill to teach him, or, a piece of knowledge to share. But at other times, it felt like he was potentially doing things because he knew at the end he was going to get a great story out of it, or a great photograph out of it that he could share on Instagram or on Facebook or on YouTube. And that would, increase his reputation as kind of a minor travel celebrity, but also, have this, which we've all felt as people who use social media, this feedback loop of, I post something and people like me. And that, I think partly, to your point, I think partly it's a technological one. Those technologies just didn't exist for my father in 1967. There was no feedback loop for him to feed into. But for Justin, there was, and there was a number of platforms that he used, in part to share his story in a very meaningful way. And I know he wanted to inspire people with what he was doing. But I think you're right that there was this other side to it that was very confused, very at odds with what he was doing. And I think, most importantly, very uncertain with how he wanted to present himself online. And, in researching this book and speaking with so many people, often I did come across this contrast between a story that the people in the moment shared with me and what was presented online. And sometimes the details were slightly different, and sometimes they were radically different. And we know that happens with social media. People exaggerate, or they take out facts, or they... But I think the question here, which I talk quite a bit about in the book, is how much of what he was doing came from a place of genuinely wanting to do it, or how much of it was from a place of knowing that it would sing well with his followers online. And I think there was a lot of tension there, deep within him, about what kind of feedback he was going to get and where that actually came from within himself.
Yeah, it's interesting to follow that thought to him deciding to go live in this cave with the sadhu, because in a way that was an experience that was in its essence not amenable to exploitation by social media.
It's
you
true.
Know what I mean? It was like something where he's going somewhere where the light's going to suck. You're not going to, he has that one photo, the last photo that he took of himself, right? In that cave, which you actually found, I believe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, his last month in the Parvati Valley, he spent the majority of it living in isolation in a stone cave in the forest, pushing himself. And I think what's most interesting about that is that in this camp, this kind of temporary village high in the mountains called Kirganga that attracts pilgrims to bathe in these holy hot springs, where Justin's cave was nearby. There's no cell service there, or there's very, very bad cell service. You can get it if you stand on a rock on a clear day. And so he was not sharing that experience with the world in real time, as so often we see on social media. And where he ultimately disappeared is a place far from cell service. He went well beyond the reach of the last cell tower as he hiked for days up to this holy lake. And so I think you could absolutely look at that last month, the last 6 weeks of his life, as one where he was not doing that. He was not instantly rapidly sharing all of these things he was realizing, all of these experiences he was having. It was a much more personal experience for him that was clear. He did post about it when he came back down into cell service, in between these two journeys, and he did write about it, but it was in a very different way. And I think you're right to look at that time in his life at the very end of one that was genuine. That was for himself.
Yeah. I don't know whether that's something to celebrate or the ultimate tragedy that the minute he started living for himself, his life ended.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's both. I think it's it's ultimately, the story is ultimately tragic of what happened, and it does end in a lot of mist and uncertainty. But I think as somebody who never met him in person, but came to know him over the past, 4.5 years of intimately following this story and talking to all of his friends and working on this book, I do take a little bit of solace knowing that last month was one that was important to him, and was one that he, I remember a quote that you gave when I interviewed you, and it's in the book, and you said, Justin is the ultimate product of social media. He couldn't get out of the frame. And that one really, really stuck with me. And I think, if there was a moment when he was trying to at least get out of the frame, it was at the end. So it is a tragic end, and there is tragedy in that fact, but it does leave me with a feeling of, if there was a way for him to conclude, to wrap up his life, I do take a bit of solace in the fact that he was doing it in that way. Finding peace in the mountains, as somebody who, since a young kid, adored nature and survivalism and naturalism. He was in his element.
It's funny, we say it's a tragedy because he was so young. How old was he when he died?
He was 36.
But in other ways, if your life can be traced in the way that we're talking about Justin's, as a struggle to attain a certain freedom, and you attain it, then there's no tragedy, right? That's a life well lived. Mm-hmm. And it does sort of feel like his life was, I know it's all retrospect changes things, but it does kind of feel like he was struggling to reach that precipice, and then he fell off. But his whole life was reaching that precipice. And so it's, in a way, it's hard to see that as a tragedy in an ultimate sense. He was certainly seeking something, as you said. Do you think that's what he was seeking? Was he seeking a way to evade his own narcissistic impulses, or evade the judgment of strangers? What do you think he was seeking?
I think partly. I think it, and in learning so much about who he was as a teenager, particularly, but also through his 20s, he was somebody that had this like deeply insatiable well that he just had to fill in with as much, knowledge and understanding as he possibly could. But there was also, long before social media, even there was this desire to kind of understand what connected him to the world. And Justin had this complicated relationship with religion from a young age, since he was a little kid, that waxed and waned. But I think there was a question in his mind that he never let go, and a belief that he never fully let go, even though he had these moments where, when he was a teenager, he was in this terrible, terrible car accident and nearly died, truck accident. He was hit by a semi and broke a lot of bones and had shards of glass embedded in his skin, and just a horrendous accident. And that really called into question, if there is something out there looking out for me, why would you bring me this close to death? For what reason? So he had these moments that called all of his beliefs into question. But I don't think he ever fully gave up on his seeking, on his quest to figure out whether or not something existed, a thread, whatever you may want to call it, Shiva, a god, or a spirit, or a natural force, the universe, Mother Earth, never gave up on that quest to see if he could find that. And so I think it was a combination of things. I think it was partly rooted in his desire to feel the intangible, and then later on, all of these other conflicting forces that kind of fed off of that, and in some ways exacerbated it, and called into question who he was at the very, very core. Not just his connection to a higher power or to the natural world around him, but to who he was, what his actions were doing, and what they were causing. So I think there was a lot of forces that really spurred him on, and that kind of twisted in his heart and in his mind for many, many years leading up to India.
Did you find a part of his life that I don't really know much about is his relationships with women? I knew some women that he was involved with, but it always seemed very, very light or kind of, and I understood at the time, when you're dedicated to traveling alone, it's hard to imagine developing a deep connection with someone because you'll either have to take them with you or leave them behind, neither of which really works if you're traveling the way he was traveling. But what did you find about his relationships with women? Did he have any real deep intimacy with women, do you think? Or was he trying to work something out first?
I mean, I think intimacy is a huge thread throughout his life. His parents divorced when he was quite young, when he was a young boy, and he after that was raised by his mom through his teenage years. And I think he always kind of struggled with developing intimate connections with people, whether they were friends or romantic partners, throughout his entire life. And I spoke with a lot of people who, had relationships with him, both fleeting and long-term relationships. And I think, even when he was traveling, this has kept coming up in my research that wherever he was, he would see these connections with animals, and he would take in a stray cat or a stray dog and rehabilitate them, and then bring them back to life. And I think that was a part of it too, was this trying to find some kind of intimate connection with something that was going to love him back the way that he wanted to love and be loved. And so he had a lot of relationships. As you said, he was a very good-looking guy. He also, was, big into martial arts and the gym. Like he was a physically fit, very good-looking guy, and he attracted the attention of a lot of women and had a lot of relationships. And I think at the core of them is something. I think you're absolutely right that it's hard to live the life that he lived and maintain them. That's not to say that he didn't. He didn't try. He was engaged once in his 20s, and he had a number of relationships that lasted more than 6 months, a year. But once he quit his job and committed his life to a life on the road, it became increasingly hard to maintain these relationships. And one of the interesting things with talking with all these people is that Justin kind of felt like this magnet that was, being dragged around the world, being, attached to all these people for different moments of time, but that each one was left with this impression of something that they felt in some way stuck to, which made it, as a researcher and as a writer, very easy because everybody remembered him. He left this incredibly deep impression on people. I'm sure you understand that. And
yeah.
But for the romantic side, it was something that was almost an impossibility to maintain the life that he wanted, which was one of ultimate freedom and independence, as well as one that was intimate and supportive, and loving, which is something that he definitely wanted throughout his life, was to feel that intimate connection and support of somebody else, a partner. And talking with a lot of his former partners, they all echo a similar thing, that they couldn't give what Justin ultimately wanted. And I don't know if that was something that is ultimately, impossible to find. I think there are ways that you can have relationships where one person is traveling a lot, but it's hard. It's really hard. And I think particularly with, the last sort of 3, 4, 5 years of his life, he was also getting attention from a lot of different places through social media and through his travels that complicated his desire to have a long-term relationship as well. But ultimately, at its core, I think he was somebody who was desperate for intimacy and desperate for connection, whether that came from a friend he met on the road, a romantic partner, even a fleeting one, and or a stranger who may offer something to him.
Yeah. So when you talk to these different people, you said a lot of his former partners felt that there was this sort of universal sense that there was something he needed that they hadn't been able to give him. Did they name that thing, or was it just a sense of incompletion or discontent or something like that, or failure maybe? I think it was almost an unsustainable view of relationships. One that I think maybe even he understood didn't really make sense. Like I remember talking with one former girlfriend of his who, he said he wanted to marry her, he wanted to have kids with her, but he also wanted to, travel indefinitely with the kids. And, there are a few people who can do that, but not a lot. And there's special circumstances that allow for that, for all sorts of reasons, financial and, childcare, all sorts of things. But I think that vision that he had, and I think this speaks a lot to his character, is that the vision that he had of his life was something that was fairly idealistic. And I see a lot of beauty in that. I don't write that off as being naive. He wanted his life to be perfect. He wanted it to be the ultimate story. And I think a lot of his decisions, whether that was in relationships or where he went or his work, ultimately came down to this seeking of perfection. And perfection's a hard thing. It's a nearly impossible thing to achieve in any relationship or any adventure. Any life. Have you ever read a book called The Razor's Edge?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think about that book a lot in terms of Justin.
Yeah, and he mentioned it. I know he read it as well, and he, ultimately that story, at least in part, is about a man who went to India to have a transformative experience and to meet a guru and came back changed.
Right.
And I know he read it. I know he thought deeply about it. He was interviewed on some podcasts. When you interviewed him twice, it was around a time when he was being interviewed by a few places, travel blogs and podcasts and things. And he mentioned The Razor's Edge on one of them, and it was before he had gone to India, but at a time when India clearly was a destination for him, clearly had occupied a place in his mind. His father went to India in the 70s and had a hugely transformative experience.
I didn't know that.
And that really, really shaped his father's life. And so Justin grew up, with a small Hindu shrine in his house, in his childhood house. He grew up with his father practicing yoga and meditation. And so all of these themes, from a young age all the way up through the books he read, including The Razor's Edge, was all of these pinpoints along his life that, sometimes I think that me ending up in India was almost an inevitability because of my father's history. I feel like for Justin, it was an inevitability as well that he would ultimately end up there.
And that was his first trip to India?
It was, yeah. He had been, his first international trip was in 2006. And at that time, he was living in San Francisco and working at kind of an alternative school. And a documentary team wanted to take a group of students to Nepal to film a kind of cultural exchange documentary. And Justin tagged along as the kind of wilderness medic. He had got his certification as a wilderness EMT, and so went along in that capacity, but also as a mentor to the students. And he hiked up in the Annapurna Mountains and had this totally crazy experience where a young Nepali girl fell from this window and cracked her skull on the ground, and Justin carried her. Ran through the mountains to the nearest village where she could be airlifted to safety. And he had these huge, profound moments in Nepal on that first trip. Meeting a reincarnated monk of one of their guides, the father of one of their guides. All of these huge experiences that it was pretty certain that he was going to go back to South Asia, and he returned to Nepal a couple times, but in 2016, that was the first time he had crossed over and gone down to India. Yeah.
I remember he went like way back into the Mustang region of Western Nepal, like a month from any place. Yeah,
that was in 2014. His trip to Nepal, so a couple years before his final trip, and he trekked up into the Mustang Valley, which is this decades ago, it was a very, very remote independent kingdom that didn't allow outsiders in, and you still need to get, a lot of permits to be able to travel there. And that was actually one of the stories that I found really interesting, because how Justin presented that story, his journey into the Mustang Valley, where he slept in caves and visited all these remote villages, and hiked back over this 5,500 meter pass in flip-flops, of all things. He presented that story as him alone in the mountains. And when in my research, in reality, he had guides and a tourist with him. And so there were all these kind of moments where, getting back to what we were saying earlier, I began to question, or just to kind of examine the fact that what he was presenting online wasn't necessarily what was happening in reality. And that really kind of guided a lot of my thinking, looking at some of the things that he posted in his final couple months in India, one of which was this infamous final line that he posted before he went on his trek up to this holy lake, which was, "If I don't come back, don't look for me." And that was a line that a lot of people read and were picked apart and wondered whether or not he ultimately wanted to disappear intentionally. And so there was a lot of issues. There was a lot of moments like that where, and his trip to the Mustang was a good example of that, of what is he presenting online and where does that match up with reality, whether in tone, in spirit, or in words, and intention.
Yeah. How do you feel about disobeying that final request? I mean, if anyone's gone looking for him, it's you, right?
That's right. I mean, after Justin disappeared, there was this enormous search launched, where his mother and a friend of his flew to India, traveled to the Parvati Valley, and spent the better part of a month on the ground working with local police officers, the American embassy, hiring helicopters, hiking up to where he disappeared to search for him. And Yeah, it's been something I've thought a lot about. Because I've traveled to the Parvati Valley twice, to follow in his footsteps and to try to uncover what happened there. Not just what happened in the disappearance, but what happened in the months that he spent there. And I think, it's interesting because in some ways, it does kind of feel like I'm disobeying somebody's final wish of, if I don't come back, don't look for me. But I also think that he also punctuated that line with kind of a winking emoji. So there was a little bit of tongue in cheek
right.
with that final line. And that was all because it most likely played well with the people who would be reading his blog or reading his Instagram account. It all kind of added to this mystery and this the story of what he was hoping to get out of this final trip. But it's something I've thought a lot about, and when I went back to India this last time in 2019 before the pandemic hit, I spent a month in the Parvati Valley, and I, in part to find his cave. There was a lot of loose ends I wanted to tie up, a lot of people I wanted to find. And I, ultimately ended up finding some of the last people to see Justin alive. Shepherds and sadhus and local people who saw him in his final weeks and had something to offer and kind of complicate or fill in the story. But I also wanted to find his cave. I wanted to find this place that he spent 3 weeks of his life in, to step inside it and to try to feel what he felt. And it was a very eerie experience to be poking through this forest and sticking my head into all these different caverns with pictures on my phone and this hand-drawn map written by a friend of his who met him in the valley, to see if it would be Justin's. And when I ultimately found it and I matched it to the video that Justin had posted online, and this quartz vein matched up and the opening was perfect, it was haunting. There was still soot from his campfire caking the ceiling of the cave. And to be in that place, to follow in his footsteps, to try to understand his story, ultimately, I hope that Justin would want his story being told, that he would be happy that his life is in book form, and that it's potentially going to inspire people to maybe in small part do the kind of traveling or adventuring that he did.
That was going to be my next question. It was how you think Justin would feel knowing that there's a book that was written about him. It's interesting, that whole don't come looking for me, and the tongue-in-cheek aspect, and the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you found the cave, at first you didn't recognize it because he had flipped the image when he posted it?
Yeah, so there's this image that still sits as the banner image on his Facebook page, and it is just this incredible self-portrait that he took inside his cave after lighting a fire. And it's just beautiful. It's just a beautiful image. It's beautifully lit and shot. And he's reclining with his book. He's posing, as we all do. But he's reclining with, a cup and a book and this flute staff that he had made in India and carried with him. The few belongings that he brought with him on this 3-week retreat in his cave. And it's an incredibly beautiful and now haunting one of the final images that he posted online. And I initially, when I got into his cave, you're right, there was something that didn't match up. The fire was in the wrong place, the opening was in the wrong place, and I realized that the image had been reversed. And that only kind of added to this, very spooky, haunting moment for me to be in there. In essentially, as I write in the book, one of the last places that Justin really called home was this cave in the mountains. And that realization that I had found it, that I had been following this story and following in this person's footsteps for 4 years at that point, since he disappeared, and to ultimately end up first in his cave, conclusively, and then the next day going up to where the few belongings that were found on the banks of the Parvati River was another moment that was, I'll remember for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, without wanting to intrude on your privacy, but when I imagine, after working so hard and like, don't come looking for me. It's not that you went looking for his body. You went looking for his essence, right? You went back to his childhood. You went to his family. You went to his girlfriends. You went looking for him in a sense that he probably couldn't have anticipated. This wasn't about find the dude. This was about find the spirit and the soul of this dude. To be there alone after that process, that must have felt like that must be one of the most powerful moments and experiences you've ever had or ever will have.
I mean, it was. And you're absolutely right. I didn't, because of the nature of the story and because of the nature of the disappearance, he disappeared, as I said, in this place with no cell service. And so they're in a very, very remote area with very, very few witnesses. Like, this is not a crime scene in a city where you can have all sorts of evidence that you can glean. And the first time I went was about 5 or 6 months after Justin had disappeared. So any evidence that I could uncover was not going to be found along the trail or necessarily in his cave. It was going to be found in the people I spoke to and interviewed. And you're right. I never went into it thinking that with the ultimate goal of solving this disappearance, or of putting this final pin onto what truly happened up there. I wanted to find out this remarkable person's life that ended up at this final point in the Himalayas. All the forces, all of the history, all of the motivations that brought him there, to me was a much more interesting story to follow than ultimately, putting a bow on whatever happened at the end. And I think, for people who pick up the book, I hope that there is still a lot of questions. And I wanted that. That was intentional. I wanted people to make up their own mind about what may have happened up there. Did Justin intentionally disappear, or was he the victim of some nefarious activity? There's all sorts of different theories that I explore about what might have happened, and all sorts of pieces of evidence that I offer. But ultimately, I want there to be ambiguity, because there is ambiguity, and there's a lot of mystery. And I think to go with the intention of trying to ultimately solve this mystery and laying the book down wouldn't do justice to the story that I saw from the very beginning, which is one of a very fascinating, complicated person, and all of those points along the way that ultimately led him to where it all ended.
Do you think there is any chance that he's alive?
Yeah.
I know you want to preserve ambiguity. I'm not going to run you through the different theories. But I mean, I've thought about that a lot.
Yeah.
Like what a guy in search of the ultimate travel experience, right? You know what I mean? Like to disappear is kind of the ultimate travel experience in a way, to leave this life. But I just can't imagine him doing that. He was such a loving person. I can't imagine him putting people through the pain of grieving him.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Unless he lost his mind or something.
No, absolutely. And that intimacy that we spoke of earlier was something that he didn't he didn't, he always wanted. There was something that he really deeply sought, and to completely sever that, with his family, with his friends, it's a different thing to, to paraphrase you, to completely step out of the frame. But it's a whole different thing to sever ties with the people that you truly love. But I think what complicated this story is where it was set. And, India for a very long time has occupied this place of, with the overlanders through the hippie trail, through to people very, very recently have gone there. People that I met on my travels who went there and had such a transformative experience that they shed their previous lives, burned their passport, and walked into a new life somewhere in that country. And there is a long, and I documented it in the book in number of examples, a long history of people who have done just that. Some who, turn up at their embassy 15 years later saying, I'm so-and-so, and I don't have my passport anymore, but I've been living in the mountains. To people who, this one fellow I met just outside of Rishikesh, where the Beatles spent a few weeks in '68. And there was this fellow who I was introduced to him, or I was sort of led by the hand, taken up to this cave on the banks of the river, saying that there's a bunch of Hindu priests who've been living there, and I thought that might be interesting, and so I, followed along. And it turned out they were all foreigners, one of whom was this Swedish man who had burnt his passport and been living in India for 7 years, in a small part in this cave near Rishikesh. And so when you look at that final line of "Don't look for me" in the context of India and its history, it adds a complication to that I think you, as somebody who knows him, and me as somebody who has interviewed all these people, deep down I think we both know that there is no part of Justin that would ever do that to the people that he deeply loved. But in the context of that country, that push and the pull that we spoke about earlier can have a profound impact upon people, and can make them do things that would surprise you, and would surprise his mother, and would surprise people who knew him very well. So it added this complication to that final line. Within this history, was this possible?
Yeah, and there are ways to die without your physical body dying. And who's to say someone doesn't have an experience where they feel that my life up until yesterday is over, and this is a new life. And I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm not disregarding anyone's feelings, but I died yesterday. I mean, I can imagine someone having that sense and feeling that the only way to honor that experience is to follow through with it. Yeah, I don't know. It's a complicated thing. I think about, like, how would I feel if he turned up? How would I feel if, whatever, this new manifestation of him turned up somehow, or, is listening to us talking right now? It's amazing. It's like he's become a phantom or something. It's a very strange thing. And that exact point is something that came up with so many people that I talked with. And I went to his a celebration of life for him. I flew down to San Francisco to attend it on the invitation of his mom and some of his friends. And I was very touched to be asked to join that very intimate celebration. But what really struck me, was not just the people that had gathered that day, and how they all came from these different walks of life, were so different, so many of them, and yet all had this, that magnet that I talked about, this like something in their core that they just, when they met him, they couldn't shake who he was and the impact that he had on them.
But what I found so interesting is that so many people said, I wouldn't be surprised if he just turned right up. I wouldn't be surprised if he walked around the corner and was still alive. And it was something that people told me about, one of his friends who he knew. Justin was this incredible survivalist and naturalist, had trained since a teenager at the Tracker School in New Jersey and the Wilderness Awareness School in Washington State. And one of his close friends who, from those years, also a tracker and a naturalist, flew out to India at the very end of the search to see if he could uncover any evidence. And one of the things he said was, being up in those mountains, you couldn't help but wonder whether or not Justin was just going to walk around the corner and ask what all the fuss was about. And so that feeling of if anybody, if there were anybody who could do that, could step off the grid, could survive in the mountains for longer than what we expect, could step into a new transformation, a new image of himself, which he did a number of times throughout his life in quite dramatic ways, it could be Justin. And that was something that a lot of people told to me. And so when they read that "Don't Look for Me" line, they knew that there was tongue-in-cheek there. They knew that he was winking at the camera, but that if anybody could do that, it would be him. And I think that in some ways, tortured is a strong word, but I think that stuck with a lot of people in a hard way because it prolonged their healing and it prolonged their acceptance. But I think for a lot of people, it was a beautiful final line to leave them with, which was hope. And I think ultimately that's something that I think about a lot. As I followed in his story and as I followed in his footsteps to India, there was a lot of hope in his story, even among tragedy and, heartbreak and a lot of things that he went through as a young man and through his life, that I think he embodied was trying to find that freedom in his life, that perfection, and that ultimately hopeful perspective on where he was going. And I admire that enormously.
Yeah, there's no perfection in life. There's only perfection in death. Right? So
yeah.
What's the expression? Count no man lucky until you've seen his death. So, well, Justin, if you're listening to this, hope you found what you were looking for, buddy, in that cave. Fucking Jesus figure. So we have to, if he does show up again, you're going to have to write a sequel to this book, The Second Coming of Justin or something.
There will be at least an epilogue, an afterword. For sure.
Yeah. Harley, thank you so much for making time to talk, and also, but much more importantly, for the care that you put into telling this story so well.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, your perspective as somebody who knew him and had met him and, clearly left an impact on you as well. So I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. The book is called Lost in the Valley of Death. And is there a subtitle? I forget. A
Story of Obsession and Danger in the Himalayas.
Oh, yeah. It's so much more than that, though. It's so, in many ways, it is the ultimate modern story. It's a portrait of someone who could only have existed now. Right? This story couldn't have happened 20 years ago, even. No. Right? That you're tracing this guy, but he left so much. He presented his own life so with so much meticulousness. That scene of you finding the cave and realizing that he had flipped the image in a way encapsulates everything. It's like, it's the ultimate irony. It's like, yes, this is the place, but it's the opposite of the way he presented it.
Yeah.
when I read that, it was just like, fuck, this whole story is right there in that one anecdote. It's incredible. Yeah. Anyway, I hope everyone listening to this will go out and buy a copy, the hard copy, because the author gets more money for the hard copy. Is it going to come out in paperback at some point? Is it an ebook? Are you going to do an audiobook?
I will be doing an audiobook. It'll definitely be an ebook, and I'm sure it'll be a paperback at a certain point. But the hardback. Are
you going to read the audiobook?
I haven't decided yet. We're in talks about what will happen there, but potentially.
Yeah. Well, I hope you do. You have a good voice, and I didn't do the audiobook for my first book, and I've regretted it ever since. And I did the audiobook for the second book, and it's a really interesting experience to sit in a booth reading your own book. Yeah. It's even, you know, I think it delivers a better product to the audience, but also just for you, it's a really interesting experience. So I hope you'll do it.
I appreciate that.
Anyway, HARLEY, thank you very much, man. Is there a website that people should go to see more of your work or what you're up to?
Sure. Yeah. My website is my name, harleyrustad.com, and you can find me on Twitter at HMRUSTAD, HMRustad, and Instagram at the same, and you can find me on Facebook too. And I post all my new writing, and hopefully be working on a next book soon.
Do you post photos of yourself lit by candles in various beautiful spots, flexing your biceps?
It's mostly trees and nature, but yeah. I'll
All right. Good. I'll probably cut this out, but I didn't find the right moment to say this. But one of the sort of emblematic images I have of Justin in my head is one day he was showing me photos he had taken. Remember, he had that motorcycle. It was it a Royal Enfield or something? Yeah. And I remember he said he was looking for that, and he asked me if I knew anyone, because I had a motorcycle for years, and I was like, dude, why are you going to buy that? That's a shitty motorcycle. Like, get a BMW or something, you know? You're not going to have to worry about it. And he's like, no, but I mean, it looks so cool, man. It's just... And it was one of those moments where I just wanted to slap him. It's like, dude, you don't buy a motorcycle because it looks cool. You buy a motorcycle because it's safe and it's well designed.
And I mentioned that in the book, that was ultimately a romantic decision. You know, there's practical decisions, but he wanted the romance. He wanted the image. He wanted, you know, this like incredible historic. And in India, he picked up the same bike. You know, there's so much kind of foreshadowing. And but that was ultimately... because that bike looks so cool. You know, those old Royal Enfield 500s, they're super cool. Whether it was the most practical bike to be touring around the U.S., I don't know.
It's uncomfortable. It broke down a lot. Yeah. So I give him shit every time it broke down. I was like, oh, you're stuck in Reno. Oh, there's a big surprise. Yeah. But anyway, there was a photo he had taken of himself, and he's like cruising down the road and the sun setting, and I think he was in the desert in Utah or something like that. And it's just a great shot. And I said to him, like, dude, how did you time the camera to take the shot in just that right moment? You know, like, because I'm thinking like someone who learned to shoot on a Nikon 35 millimeter, you know, there's a timer, remote or whatever. And he looked at me, and the expression was one of like, kind of like compassion for an older person who doesn't understand how the world is now. Right. And also mixed with like a bit of shame that he was about to like admit that it was just a magic trick. Right. And he said, no, dude, I shoot video and then I just choose a frame, the best frame from it. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. Like, oh, but I'll never forget that expression on his face, because before I knew what he was going to say, I saw like part of this is feeling bad for me and part of this is feeling ashamed for himself, whatever's coming here.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we picked an image of him for the back cover in the U.S. edition. I think the Canadian edition might have it too, but And that's an image of him outside his cave, and he's walking in the forest, and it just kind of, this is perfect image. But that was a still from a video that he took that he posted online. And so it was something that he did and was very familiar with, all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah,
did you ever see did you see the image that he took of himself holding my book, sitting on the motorcycle in front of the teepee?
Yeah.
What a great shot.
I mean,
we should Photoshop your book into that photo.
Yeah. I mean, he had a great eye. Like
he's great.
I kind of dabble in pictures, and, I've learned a bit from my dad, but he had a really good eye for light and for movement, but I think most importantly for telling a story and, or communicating some kind of emotion, which is everything we want in a photograph. And, even the one which he kind of was very happy that Facebook had kind of, flagged as breaking some kind of censor rules was the one of him, stark naked on the Bolivian salt flats, with his body mirrored in the reflection. It's just like a beautiful image, but of course he was going to strip down and get this picture, but it says so much. Like, it's a beautiful art picture. And even his videos that he took and he posted on YouTube are these really, really beautiful, haunting, wordless videos that document a certain aspect of his life. And it was interesting that he chose that, in the vein of Baraka, one of his favorite movies, but also that he wasn't narrating, he wasn't telling his story, he was doing it through images in this very, kind of not self-aggrandizing way, I found very interesting and very beautiful. And he had a great eye for what he knew was going to play well, but also what would tell a good story and communicate an experience. And I think your comment about how this story couldn't exist at any other time, I think you're spot on. I mean, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you're right that these things didn't exist, these forces didn't exist. And even 20 years from now, Instagram has dramatically changed from 2015, 2016, It's now, shopping, really, and tons of ads, and everything kind of looks like an ad. And he was at that period where Instagram was really starting to change, and presented itself in a very different way. So I think you're absolutely right that what happened to him and his story could only really exist at this very specific point in time.
That's it. Hope you enjoy this episode, this conversation with HARLEY RUSTAD, and I hope you'll check out Justin's Instagram feed, see the beautiful boy at play, and maybe check out the previous episodes that I recorded with Justin back in the day. Links to all that are included on the episode page on my website, tangentiallyspeaking.com, thatchrisryan.com. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your love and your emails and your intros and all the rest of it. And I'll talk to you again soon.